Coleman, I did my project on desalination in the Anthropocene, a look at emerging desal technologies to meet global water demands. So I started with this nifty quote from the King James. Thought it was interesting. The people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried unto the Lord, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. So kind of biblical desal reference there. So why do we talk about water desal? Well, frankly, we're on the brink of a global water crisis. We've talked a lot about this in class. As the population has risen, so hasn't the demand for water, which puts pressure on the planet's finite supply. Add to the scarcity the fact that we're polluting what little we do have, and you can see why desal has become an increasingly important technology. What is it? Well, simply put, it's the process that removes salt and other minerals to create fresh and drinkable water. So the world's population is rapidly increasing. It's predicted to be 9.7 billion by 2050 and 11 billion by 2100. The dramatic growth is driven largely by increasing numbers of people surviving to reproductive age. And it's been accompanied by major changes: fertility rates, increasing urbanization, accelerating migration. More than half of the global population between now and 2050 is expected to occur in Africa. So, safe and readily available drinking water is important for public health, whether it's used for drinking, domestic use, food production, recreational purposes. So, polluted water is one of the world's leading causes of disease and death, particularly for children under the age of 5. So, improved water supply and sanitation, better management, resources can boost the country's economic growth and contribute greatly to poverty reduction. So we also talk about conflict zones with water, and we know that's the case in all throughout Africa, some parts of Asia, South America, and we need to understand that the limited access to fresh water is creating some of these conflict zones. So women and children, they are a big proponent of water access, water sourcing in Africa, and the burden is on them to do so, and they're unable to perform a lot of their duties. So we know that these social structures and social dynamics are different in Africa, and that's a great cause for strain within those social nets. Desalination is the process of removing salt and minerals, so we know that, but it also needs to be noted that there are sources of that water, generally seawater, brackish, or wastewater. So with thermal desal, which is one of the oldest known desal technologies, relies on alternating evaporation and condensation of water. After the water is distilled, the impurities are separated. And then the distillation doesn't remove like all the volatile chemicals like chloramines and some of the it doesn't remove all the chloramines with the same effectiveness that a reverse osmosis does. The techniques are robust and reliable, but they have little potential for a further improvement. So they're energy intensive, and they typically produce quantities of water that's far less than what is needed. So that's the thermal side. On the physical side, the membrane side, reverse osmosis is primarily used for drinking. It's a newer technology. It's a filtration process that forces water through a series of very fine asymmetric membranes. And the osmosis is driven by the natural tendency of dissolved molecules to equalize their concentrations on either side of that membrane. There's 4 phases in reverse osmosis: the pretreatment, pressurization, membrane separation, and post-treatment stabilization. What's left is called the reject stream, which is that hypersaline water, and what's fed through is the permeate. The choice of the process depends on a lot of parameters, but first and foremost on the nature of the water to be treated, seawater or brackish. So we talk about seawater desal, and it must be adjacent to the ocean. So location is a big deal. Seawater reverse osmosis is typically more energy intensive than brackish. So that's about 10 to 14 kilowatt hours per 1,000 gallons versus the brackish, which is about 3 to 5. So it's a little more than double. The plants have the advantage of returning the brine to the sea if done in a diffused way. It's a little safer, and it's plentiful. The source is plentiful. It's the ocean. So brackish locations are a little more flexible. The farther the source water is located from the ocean, the lower the salinity, with those total dissolved solids, and the lower the osmotic pressure that's required, so the lower energy expenditure. While brackish has a lower proportion of TDS, total dissolved solids, in the feed water, it's a little more challenging to dispose the product or that concentrate, and it requires a little less energy to overcome that process. So when we compare the cost between brackish and seawater desal, the major aspects to evaluate are location, transportation, potential co-location of seawater with a power plant, sustainability, technical, economic. So there's quite a few factors to consider. The first desal plant, we talked about the history, that was built in the 30s was present-day Saudi Arabia. So they're kind of the progenitors. In the United States, the U.S. Congress passed the Saline Water Act in 52 and 65. California was the first commercial reverse osmosis plant. And now, where we are today, there's almost 20,000 plants worldwide providing water for over 300 million people, actually. So the use of groundwater to irrigate crops beginning in the 70s almost depleted Saudi Arabia's aquifers completely and set the country on a completely unsustainable path. We talked a little bit about this in class. The government had to end subsidies for water-intensive crops. It's essentially the largest country in the world without running surface water and has one of the highest rates of water consumption in the world. So providing new sources of potable water for the Saudi kingdom, their growing population and expanding industry, is going to be a real strain and has been. As of October 2020, they had a total of 33 desal plants in 17 locations run by the Saline Water Conversion Corporation. Ultimately, the United States is in a different track, and they began their desal in the 1960s after John F. Kennedy spoke of the need for desalination. San Diego recently went online, and they've had a bit of controversy, but their plant is massive, costs roughly $5 billion for that plant. Historically, San Diego kind of relies on Colorado River for their water. However, with a permanent acidification of the West, the source was drying up, and so they expanded to desal. They worked a partnership with the Israeli company that we've talked about quite a bit, Poseidon. They contracted to build in Carlsbad, now the largest plant in the Western Hemisphere. It's 10% of the area's water needs that they can produce. However, it is twice the cost. So that's that cost benefit there. The project's success led to the construction of a similar plant in Orange County, in Huntington Beach, and that's also a contentious issue. So the California Coastal Commission scheduled a vote to end it actually this month here in May of 2022, and we'll see how that plays out. But it goes back to the fundamental question: is it worth the energy cost? There's 17 of these plants in California currently, but we're in the driest period in California in 1,200 years. So this is going to have to be part of the solution. Then we get to Israel, one of the driest regions on Earth. The surface water coming from the Jordan, it's disputed among 3-4 countries, and it's, the groundwater's become undrinkable due to encroaching seawater and sewage. So this is a great success story. The government approached the construction of new reverse osmosis in the Mediterranean, along the Mediterranean, and they've embraced the ethic of efficiency, low-flow toilets, shower heads, nationwide National Water Authority building innovative treatment systems. We talked about extensively in class, and they recapture 86% of the water that goes down the drain and use it for irrigation. Just amazing. So today they get 55% of their domestic supply from desal and brackish groundwater, seawater and brackish groundwater, and they produce 150 million cubic meters. So their national system uses a pipeline to connect desal plants with consumers, making it possible for such an incredibly significant portion of the population to get its water supply from desal. So that's sort of an amazing process. Their approach has been successful. With desal, it's introduced a potential path to peace in the region. So it comes with all these side factors: social, political, economic, and it's really helped their water scarcity. They now outsource their technologies, and the companies that started there are helping throughout the world. When we look at Singapore, also a bit of a success story. They lack natural water bodies. Population is over 5 million. They need to creatively manage their water. The extreme challenge that they had endured was 430 million gallons a day, and they had to figure out a way to supply that, so they created the 4 national taps. Water from local catchments was one piece of that. Imported water, high-grade reclaimed water, known as new water, and then desal. So the 3 main stages in purifying their water was, first was microfiltration. The second stage was reverse osmosis with a semi-permeable membrane. The third was the ultraviolet disinfection, which kills the bacteria and the viruses. And now new water has 5 plants distributed around the country, and hopefully by 2060 they'll be supplying 55% of their water through desalination. The process that they're using, reverse osmosis, does take 3.5 kilowatt hours per meter cubed of energy. It's quite energy intensive, and they're hoping to reduce that through electrodeionization, and they're hoping to incorporate some more green energy supplies. So, their electric field pulls the dissolved salts from water and only uses 1.65 kilowatt hours per meter cubed. So there are some areas for efficiency. They're also exploring biomimicry. It's a method that mimics biological processes, like mangroves, and they've experimented with euryhaline fish, and that organism is able to adapt to a wide range of salinities, like certain species like mollies, green crabs, some sharks. They extract fresh water from their seawater using a small amount of energy through osmoregulation, which is an active process that an organism uses to maintain its water content. So osmotic pressure in their bodies homeostatically regulated in a manner that keeps that organism's fluid from becoming too diluted or concentrated. So desalination, what are the limitations? We talked about the cases, but we didn't focus on as much on limitations. Location, huge limitation. You can only access that saline, that seawater, if you're on the coast, and then brackish is only in those back inland waters. So you have to be near the source to produce that product. Brackish has obviously the lower energy expenditure, and these seawater plants are going to be intensely energy intense. So when you're building a plant, the type, the cost to the consumer, who's going to pay for it, how are they going to pay for it, that can be burdensome. However, there are permitting issues as well. So a lot of people with a not in my backyard situation that we see throughout America. Desal is not without its environmental critics. We know that. Using fossil fuels to power plants can produce a ton of greenhouse gas emissions. Creating fresh water out of seawater, we need to do something with that brine, that salt that remains. And it can be so so rich in contaminants that it does damage an environment. It can steal the oxygen if it's not diffused properly. On the coast, it's very strong, can kill wildlife, vegetation. So, we need to take into account that there's anti-scaling agents and chlorine removing chemicals in the brines. There are ways to mitigate it, and the discharge system is an important piece there. So Perth, Australia, they transport the direction impact range of the discharge plume in a controlled way, so it doesn't impact fisheries. They take into consideration tides, currents, water depth. So it's just a thoughtful process that needs to come along with that the discharge. There's also a limitation of process. Are we going to do distillation, reverse osmosis, seawater, brackish, as I said? They all use a lot of energy. Currently, desal around the world consumes 200 million kilowatt hours a day, with the average energy cost between 40 and 50% of those operating costs. It has to be noted that fossil fuels we've reduced using fossil fuels in many of the facilities, so we're getting better, but this was largely dependent on fossil fuels when energy was cheap in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and so we're trying to make that switch and change our energy portfolio. Desal can be expensive for both distillation and reverse osmosis, as I said, but the last 3 decades that cost has dropped by more than half, so that's good to see. The case studies show operations in the wealthier countries, which is 75 or more percent of these desal operations are in places like Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Israel, United States. How do we make it more cost effective? Well, technological developments, things that are doing in MIT with nanotechnologies, making those more efficient membranes, incorporating renewable sources of energy, increasing scale, government subsidies, privatization, and then competition are going to help bring some of these costs down. Advances in technology, using chemical-free processes like porous lava stone, concentrate management. We talked about that before. Electrodeionization in Singapore is also an emerging technology that is leading the field, and we're hoping to see that coupled with their biomimicry. More desal plants are built coupled with solar, like in Australia, the Sydney water desal plant. They use solar and wind. They actually coupled with a 67 turbine wind farm. New renewables to work with these plants are huge. Currently, only 1% of the desal plants use those renewables. So it's an important tool in fighting water scarcity. It's not a panacea. We can use a reliable source of water. It can be a reliable source of water when the world's aquifers are getting depleted. There are diverse options. We can build conservation into the model like Israel does. Saudi Arabia does something a little bit different in terms of their operations, working with the private sector, so that can be a piece of the success moving forward. But ultimately, it's about energy and cost and impact. These are the things that motivate humans to make decisions. So having a reliable water source to drink and considering the world's scarcity and potentially, facing some of these changes in climate change, we need this opportunity, and we need it at a better cost with less environmental impact, and we need to share our technologies. Thank you.